All right, welcome back, everybody, to another edition of our RRAR Legislative Interview Series. Joining me today is Anna Beavon Gravely. She is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation. It's a nonpartisan research organization that works to understand trends and inform decision-making. So we are very thankful to have Anna join us today. So Anna, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think first, our audience always likes to hear about the people that we're talking to. So if you wouldn't mind providing a little bit of background about yourself and the work you're doing within your organization, because I think it's fascinating and right up the alley of a lot of our membership.
Yeah, so I have a long history of working in the political space. I graduated from Meredith College, majored in political science. I actually had a meeting with a graduate program last week at Meredith. It was funny to sort of like relive some of the campus, but also just the anomaly of being able to work in what my major is.
Yeah.
And so that was a lot of fun down memory lane, but majoring in political science, I've worked in grassroots advocacy for about 8 to 9 years. And then I've been with NC Free just past 4 years. It's hard to believe. But as I talk about the lifespan of NC Free, 2 years in normal life is sort of like 1 year in NC Free life. And the reason I say that is because odd years and even years look very different for us. We are in an odd year right now. So it's, we're sort of gearing up for the conversations and the prep for the analysis that we're going to do during the even year. When we do look at campaign finance reports, this year is sort of collecting and building that foundation. And really, we only have 2 reports this year, or 2 reports that we look at in odd years and 4 in even years. And so campaign finance, we'll spend a lot of time talking about that today, but outside of that, in odd years, we do a legislative business rating. It's our flagship product that has been part of NC Free's culture and life for a long, long time. This year, NC Free turns 40. So we're starting to feel our age a little bit, I think. And so with our LBR, this is going to be one of those things where we rate lawmakers based on their philosophical commitment to free enterprise. And so this is one of my favorite things that we get to do. It's a long process. We have a research committee comprised of board members, of lobbyists, government affairs professionals, people who are working closely at the General Assembly with these issues. And we really asked the question, where was the greatest opportunity for free enterprise to thrive? And where was the greatest threat to free enterprise? And so that product will be coming out in November, the very beginning of November, end of October, just before our leadership luncheon. And that's another flagship event that we do. We do every year. We have a luncheon that brings together members of the business community and lawmakers to have off-the-record conversations about issues impacting business in North Carolina. And it takes place at the Angus Barn. So you guys are welcome to join. We'd love to have you be there with us. I think you'd really enjoy it. But this year it'll be in November as opposed to in previous years it's been in December. But those are the big things we've got going on right now.
That's great. Yeah, I was. I'm really happy to have you on today because I as I mentioned to you before we went live, I heard you speak at a chamber event, and I just thought a lot of the information that you had was so important to understand, especially within this election cycle, but also as we head into 2024. You know, the NC Realtors PAC, our PAC has been one of the most substantial PACs in the state. How big of a role do PACs play in the current election arena? Obviously, they've always been important, but as we see a lot more money being contributed, are PACs even playing an even bigger role than they used to?
I think that I've sort of put inside campaign money and then outside campaign money into 2 different buckets. And they play different roles. And they have different abilities to be able to impact voters. Ultimately, that's the whole point. That's why we people spend money in elections. They want to get their message across to voters in the most effective way possible. And PAC money is definitely an avenue. And there's a chart that'll be linked below, or you'll be able to access, that breaks down the PAC spending between 2010 and 2020. This is one of the benefits of being an organization that is 40 years old, is that we have some longevity and trend lines that we can show. And so looking at the difference between the amount of PAC money that was spent in 2020 versus what was spent in 2010 is just outrageous. And so one thing that may stand out to your audience is that the Realtors PAC was the only state PAC that was in the top 5 in 2010 and the top 5 in 2020. And you can notice the increase in their spending because the more money you have, the more money that's coming into the state, the more you have to spend to have the same amount of noise or the same opportunity to be heard or to tell your story. And so the way I like to say is there are some races where you can spend $5 and it feels like $20. And there's some races where you can spend $5 and it feels like 20 cents because of the amount of noise of other people who are spending in that race as well. And it can go both ways. We usually see your $5 can sort of feel like 20. That happens historically in judicial races, and your $5 feeling like 20 cents happens in competitive races, whether they're General Assembly races or gubernatorial, presidential, senatorial, any of those top of the ticket ballot races are going to be very, very expensive and very loud when it comes to money spent in advertising to try to tell the story of the candidate.
You briefly mentioned there the presidential election. So looking forward to 2024, how big of a role is North Carolina going to play in the presidential election? And additionally, is North Carolina now officially, quote unquote, a purple state at this point, as opposed to a red or blue state?
Yeah, that is such a great question. I love North Carolina politics because I feel like we're the major leagues of state politics. Our state is, and our voters are very educated. They are very fickle, and they know exactly what they want. We are one of 9 states where unaffiliated voters outnumber Republican voters and Democrat voters. And so I think that adds an element of the pickiness that voters have. And so we've seen in 12 and 16 and 20, we've seen voters go Republican president, Republican Senate, Democrat governor, Republican lieutenant governor, and Democrat attorney general. And so those are right down the ballot where voters are selecting which candidate they want to align with. And so it's has more to do with the kind of message that's resonating and not wanting to vote for the other candidate. I think we've seen that happen, and we saw that happen in 20, we saw that happen in 16, where voters are choosing to not vote for either not vote at all in that particular race, or they're voting for the opposite person because they don't want to vote for the other person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
They're choosing to vote against the Democrat by voting for the Republican and vice versa. Sure. And granted, that's not every single voter, but we're seeing enough of that to be able to have that be a storyline as part of the voting story of North Carolina. And so as to the purple element, I think we've been purple for a really long time. And I think all we have to do is look at the tightness in our competitive races in the General Assembly, though the outcomes may not be as tight with majorities and supermajorities, but the race and the amount of money spent to get there, to get that outcome, is pretty high. And so I think the purpleness of North Carolina, purpleness not being an actual word, but the purpleness of North Carolina is here to stay for quite some time.
I know it's a long way out in the world of presidential politics, but if
Oh yeah.
polls are any indication of anything, if it is Biden versus Trump again in 2024, do you expect it to be another closely contested race in North Carolina?
I do. I have actually been paying a little bit more attention to how the indictments are impacting Trump. And his approval rating is slipping slightly with each new indictment. Previously, I thought that the indictments weren't really going to have that much of an effect on him, because if you're pro-Trump, you're going to stay pro-Trump. But his approval rating just isn't telling that story exactly. It's a slow chip, but since all these indictments are starting so early, and you said it yourself, we have so much time between now and the election itself. And so I'm curious. I'll be watching that. I'm curious to see how that those indictments impact the former President Trump, and his margin of victory in 20 in North Carolina was a lot narrower than 16. And so I think that's going to also have an impact. So it just seems like his winning margin is slipping a little bit. So that's sort of a non-answer to your question. I did like every political person and hedged.
Yes. Yeah. No, I can appreciate that. I think my next question is sort of goes hand in hand with presidential politics, but also in a wider range of politics. If we look at how polarizing politics has become, and in my opinion, this is just my personal opinion, there's a sense of exhaustion with the talking points on the far right and the far left. I think there is a clamoring to come to the middle, a little bit more common sense. Do you think that there is a pathway for more moderate candidates or even a third party candidate to make headway during the upcoming election cycles, maybe in 2024 or beyond that? Or will it always be the same, that just those third party moderate candidates aren't going to have much of a chance?
Well, I think voters always say during the legislative time, because there are two different times of politics. There's legislative and lawmaking, and then there's campaigning and running for office. And the campaigning and running for office, there are people who love that, and there are people who love the legislative side. And so when you're in the lawmaking legislative side, you feel a lot of the gridlock. You feel a lot of the conflict that happens between both parties. And when you're in the campaigning side, that's where you sort of get swept up in ideas and vision and a view of a better end state. And so I think that when you deal with the legislative lawmaking side, that's where people were like, I wish people would just agree. Can't we just come to the middle and find a way to talk about something that really matters? And it means reducing the amount of government in people's lives, or whatever your issue is. But when it comes time for elections to take over and for candidates to run for office again, there's not really any place for that middle ground. For some of the reasons that we talked about a little bit ago about the amount of money that's being spent in races and the two-party structure. A lot of what that really helps candidates do is the fundraising. It provides a known, and we use known because not all Republicans are true to the platform. Not all Democrats are true to the platform, but there is something to hold them down. When we have, there's been a lot of conversation with the No Labels Party. That's been getting a lot of attention, a lot of coverage. And I think it is a wonderful idea. I think when you talk about having a candidate that is somewhere in between, that doesn't really adhere to a label, that sounds really great. But then when you start asking questions like, what is their platform? What do they stand for? How do we hold them accountable to something? it gets a little bit harder to get behind that, because you can agree on, I don't want to be as far right as this person or as far left as this person, but there's a huge amount in the middle. And so does that end up looking like fiscally conservative, socially liberal, socially conservative, and fiscally liberal, which would be the opposite? Took me a second to say that correctly. And so I think we just don't know. And that's where you sort of like just throw your hands in the air and go, well, I guess we're going to go with these two-party systems that we know. And the fundraising mechanisms make it really, really hard to break from having Republican candidates and Democrat candidates.
That makes sense. And I expected that. I was just curious if there was any.
Oh yeah.
And the final question that I have for you before I let you go today, we touched on this briefly, but in regard to spending money on a campaign, and you mentioned from 2010 to 2020, the change, but are you seeing even more money being spent each year on campaigns, even on these local and state campaigns? Forget about, the national politics, but is more money, like I remember during your presentation, you shared some of the figures and I was shocked that so much money was being spent on certain races.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that I find fascinating, which is sort of why I started doing this, is trying to figure out like what are we spending per vote? Because it feels like when we start talking about campaign money and the reports that have just come out for the mid-year reports, it feels like we're talking about monopoly money, because it's so crazy to understand. And people are buying up that Park Place. That is for sure. But when we break it down to what is our cost per vote, and for the gubernatorial race, I took a look at 2012, 2016, and 2020 to sort of see, is there a trend line that exists? And so when you look at 2012, it was about $5 a vote. 2016, it was just around $10 a vote. 2020 was just under $15 a vote. And so if that trend continues, we're looking at $19 to $20 a vote for a gubernatorial race. And with the projections and the amount of money, like in this election cycle thus far, Josh Stein has raised $11.2 million, which for context, that is not much less than what Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest raised total for the campaign when he ran in 2020. And so I think we're going to shatter that estimate and go a little higher. And it would not surprise me if we got to like $25 to $30 a vote. And so that, just for the gubernatorial race alone, that's crazy. And when we start looking at legislative races and competitive districts, those start to feel, when we had our first $1 million race, which a campaign raised $1 million for a legislative seat that you get paid less than $14,000 a year, that was mind blowing. But we experienced multiples of $1 million races in the last 3 cycles. And we nearly had a $3 million race in the 2020 cycle in that Senate District 18 with Mary Wills Bodie and E.C. Sykes. And so she was about $200,000 shy of $3 million. Wow. And so again, I'm not going to be surprised if we have at least one, but I think we'll probably get a couple $3 million races in 2024.
Huh. Well, that's those are wild numbers. So, when you
wild,
it just puts everything in a perspective. Mm-hmm. Well, I think I could talk to you. I have a bunch of more questions that I could get to, so maybe we'll have to do a part 2 of this interview series as
part 2 sounds great.
Election season. But I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us, Anna, and thank you for the information. And we look forward to talking to you soon. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
You too. All right, this was